It was just another normal day online. People were scrolling, watching videos, checking the news. And then it happened, a headline popped up that nobody expected. Rick Harrison's son sentenced to life in prison. At first, many thought it was fake. A rumor. Maybe a clickbait title from a gossip blog. But no, it was real. And within hours, the news had spread everywhere. Rick Harrison, the man known for running a pawn shop on the hit show Pawn Stars, had always seemed like a strong, focused, and even funny person. He built his brand around honesty, hard work, and family. For over a decade, fans had watched him laugh, argue, and make deals with his dad, his son, and his crew. People felt like they knew him. So when this news came out, it didn't just feel like a crime story, it felt personal. But what shocked everyone even more wasn't just the sentence, it was the silence. For a long time, Rick didn't say anything. No posts, no videos, not even a statement through a lawyer or rep. People were left guessing. Was he hiding? Was he too angry to speak? Too sad? Too confused? That silence made the story even more mysterious. People started digging. They wanted to know what Rick's son had done to get life in prison. Not a few years. Not a fine, life. That's the kind of punishment given to people who commit the most serious crimes. But this wasn't just about the legal case. People wanted to know the full story. How did this happen? What was going on in their lives behind the scenes? As the internet buzzed with theories, some fans remembered seeing less of Rick's son on the show in recent years. He used to be there often, making deals and joking around like everyone else. But then he slowly disappeared from the spotlight. Now people started asking, was something already going wrong back then? The more people looked into it, the more questions they had. Was Rick aware of his son's behavior? Did he try to help him? Were there signs? And if there were, why didn't anyone say anything? All of these thoughts were going through people's minds, and still, Rick said nothing. That silence felt loud. In the world of celebrity, silence is rare. Most stars are quick to post statements, defend themselves, or share their side of the story. But Rick didn't do any of that. And maybe that's what made people even more curious. They started watching old episodes, reading old interviews, trying to find clues. They wanted to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. Some felt sympathy. Others felt confusion. A few even felt anger. But one thing was clear. Everyone wanted answers. The hook in this story isn't just the crime, it's the image. Rick Harrison is a man many grew up watching. He was the no-nonsense guy who always knew the value of things. He taught people how to spot what was real and what was fake. And now people were trying to do the same with his life. What was real? What had he kept hidden? Was he now the one facing something too hard to measure? There's a strange feeling that comes when someone who looks strong shows weakness, not physical weakness, but emotional. Fans expected Rick to stand tall, maybe say something tough, maybe defend his family. But instead he stayed silent. And in that silence, people began to feel something deeper. Maybe he was heartbroken. Maybe he was trying to protect his son. Or maybe he was just in shock, like everyone else. And so, the world waited. Some searched for news updates, hoping for new information. Others made YouTube videos, breaking down every piece of the story. Some defended Rick, saying no parent can fully control their child. Others said he should have seen this coming. The internet was full of opinions, but the one voice missing was Rick S. That quote's what made this first moment so heavy. Not the court decision alone, but the feeling that something had changed forever. A man who once smiled on camera, who once made jokes about rare coins and old guitars, was now facing something no amount of money or knowledge could fix. People weren't just watching a case. They were watching a man go silent. A father, a public figure, and someone they thought they knew. And they were all asking the same question: what would he say if he ever decided to speak? Rick Harrison had spent his entire career building something that people loved. His pawn shop, the place where treasures and forgotten items were bought and sold, had become the setting for one of the most successful reality shows ever. Pawn Stars was a hit. People enjoyed watching Rick and his team argue, laugh, and haggle over items. It was a show about history, money, and quirky people. But behind that TV persona, behind the cameras and the jokes, there was a side to Rick Harrison that viewers didn't see. For many years, Rick's family appeared to be as much a part of his brand as his pawn shop. Fans watched him interact with his son, Corey, who was part of the shop's team. They shared laughs, made deals, and seemed like a regular family. But just like in any family, things weren't always perfect. Viewers didn't know the whole story behind the Harrison family. While their business grew, so did their personal struggles. And one of the biggest questions that had been floating around after the news of Rick's son's life sentence was, did Rick know? Did he have any idea that something so serious was going on with his son? The answer, at least in the early days, seemed to be no. There was no sign that Rick had seen this coming. In fact, if anything, he seemed as shocked as the rest of the world. For someone who had been in the spotlight for so long, someone who was known for his sharp mind and ability to negotiate even the toughest deals, it was strange that he didn't seem prepared for this. Some fans wondered how a father could be so unaware of what his son was going through. After all, it's not just any crime, it's a life sentence. The question hung heavy: how could something so serious happen without warning? Rick Harrison's silence became one of the most talked about aspects of the story. He didn't speak to reporters, he didn't make any public statements, and he didn't post anything on social media. In a world where celebrities are always trying to control their image, Rick's silence was unusual. It left people feeling like there was something more beneath the surface, something he wasn't ready to reveal. Was it because he didn't know what to say? Was he protecting his son, or was he too devastated by the situation to speak? The longer Rick stayed silent, the more curious people became. Fans wanted to understand how he was coping. Was he angry? Was he ashamed? Or was he simply lost in the face of a tragedy that no one could have expected? Many started to look at his past, trying to find clues. Had he said anything about his son in previous interviews? Was there anything that might have hinted at what was happening in their private lives? Some even went back to old episodes of Pawn Stars, hoping to find signs that something was wrong. But all they saw were smiles, jokes, and deals being made. Nothing seemed out of place. As the weeks went by, speculation began to grow. Some people assumed Rick was keeping quiet out of loyalty to his son, not wanting to add to the public shame. Others thought that maybe he was in shock and didn't know how to respond. Whatever the reason, his silence only made the story more compelling. The public felt like they were waiting for something big. They were waiting for Rick to break that silence and speak up, to give them some answers. But there was another layer to this story that kept people interested. It wasn't just about the crime or the punishment, it was about the father-son relationship. Rick had always been a strong figure on TV. He had a reputation for being tough, straightforward, and in control. But now that control seemed to slip away. His family, his legacy, everything he had worked for was suddenly being questioned. And people wanted to know how Rick was dealing with it. Was he still the same man they had seen on TV, or had this tragic event changed him forever? At the same time, there were those who believed Rick should have seen this coming. After all, how could a father not notice that his son was heading down such a dark path? Some people argued that Rick, being in the public eye for so long, must have known something was wrong. They pointed to his son's disappearing act from Pawn Stars over the years as a clue. Why did he stop appearing on the show? Was he hiding something? Was Rick, who had built his career on reading people and understanding their motives, blind to his son's struggles? As time passed, the questions only grew louder. Fans and critics alike wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened behind the scenes, what had led to this terrible situation. Was it just a case of a son making a terrible mistake? Or was there more to it? And more importantly, would Rick ever share his side of the story? People were still waiting for the moment when Rick would break his silence. They didn't expect him to give all the details, but they wanted something. A small statement. A hint of what he was going through. Even if it was just a few words, people needed to hear from him. The world wanted to know if Rick Harrison, the man they had watched for years, was still the same person. Was he still the strong father figure who ran a pawn shop, or had this tragedy completely changed him? The longer Rick stayed quiet, the more the public speculated. It was as if they were all waiting for a resolution, for something to happen that would make sense of this chaotic situation. Was Rick hiding something? Was he protecting his son, or was he simply overwhelmed by everything? The silence was deafening. But as the days went by, people started to wonder if Rick would ever speak up. Would he address the tragedy, or would he continue to stay quiet, leaving everyone in the dark? And so, the mystery deepened. Fans, reporters, and even fellow celebrities were all wondering the same thing. When would Rick Harrison speak? What would he say? What was going on behind the scenes of Pawn Stars? And most importantly, What had happened to Rick's son to cause such a devastating outcome? The silence was powerful. It made people question everything they thought they knew about Rick Harrison. The only thing left was to wait and see if Rick would ever break his silence, and if so, what he would say. Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars, had been known for his business savvy and calm demeanor in front of the cameras. Over the years, he built a reputation as a no-nonsense businessman, a man who could handle the toughest deals without blinking. Fans knew him as a strong, confident figure, one who rarely showed weakness. But when his son was sentenced to life in prison, everything changed. Rick, who had always been in control, suddenly found himself in a situation where he had no control, no answers, and no easy way to fix what had happened. The silence that followed was deafening, and fans couldn't help but wonder, was this the same Rick Harrison they had seen on TV for so many years? It was almost like watching a man who had spent his whole life building an empire slowly crumble before everyone's eyes. Rick had always been a steady presence in the world of reality TV. Viewers knew him as the face of the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas, the man who could spot a good deal from a mile away. He had a business, a family, and a career that millions admired. But all of that was now overshadowed by one tragic event: his son's life sentence. The man who had always been in control now seemed like he was lost in the middle of a storm, trying to find his way out. The silence that followed his son's sentencing was hard to ignore. It was more than just the quiet of a father grieving his child's fate. It was the silence of someone who had always known how to talk, how to explain himself, how to offer his side of the story. Rick was a man used to speaking his mind on TV, whether he was negotiating for a rare item or joking with his team. Yet now he had nothing to say. Fans, reporters, and the public at large were all waiting for him to speak out. They wanted to hear what he thought, how he felt, and what had led to this moment. But Rick didn't give them any answers. The curiosity surrounding his silence grew as days passed. People started asking, was Rick too ashamed to speak? Was he trying to protect his son from more public attention? Or was he so devastated by the whole situation that he didn't know how to respond? Whatever the reason, the longer he stayed silent, the more people speculated. The public's curiosity turned into frustration. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why Rick wasn't speaking, what he was going through, and whether he was handling the situation differently than anyone could have imagined. As the weeks went by, it became clear that Rick's silence wasn't just about the crime. It was about something deeper. It was about the idea that someone who had been so open for so long, someone who had shared parts of his life with millions of viewers, was now closed off. It was almost as if Rick had built a wall around himself, one that was hard to break through. Fans and reporters alike were left wondering, was he ever going to talk? What was he hiding, if anything? Was he afraid to face the public, or was there something even more personal at play that he wasn't ready to share? And then there were the questions about Rick's role as a father. Everyone knew he had a son, and viewers had watched that relationship unfold on the show over the years. But no one knew the full story behind closed doors. Was there tension between Rick and his son? Did Rick know what was going on in his son's life? Some fans began to look back at the episodes of Pawn Stars, trying to find clues that might explain what had happened. They wondered, had Rick missed the warning signs? Was there something in his son's behavior that should have raised a red flag? People started looking at old interviews, past interactions between father and son, hoping to find answers that would help them make sense of the situation. There was a sense that Rick, in his usual calm and collected manner, had missed something important. As a businessman, he was used to reading people, understanding their motivations, and making tough decisions. But when it came to his son, it seemed like he had been blindsided. Some fans began to question whether Rick had been too focused on his career, too caught up in the fame that came with being on a hit TV show. Had he neglected his family in the process? Had his fame blinded him to what was happening in his own home? The longer Rick stayed silent, the more these questions began to surface. The mystery deepened. The world wanted to know if Rick Harrison had missed something, and if so, what could have been done to prevent it. But even more than that, people wanted to know about the emotional toll this was taking on Rick. He had built a successful business, a show that millions loved, and a family that seemed to have it all. Now all of that was in question. His son was in prison for life, and Rick was left to pick up the pieces. The emotional weight of the situation was heavy, and the public was left wondering how he was handling it. Was he overwhelmed? Was he angry? Or was he simply heartbroken? There were no answers, just silence. And that silence made people curious. They wanted to know what was going on behind the scenes, what Rick was really feeling, and whether he was ever going to open up about it. The mystery of Rick's silence was like a puzzle. Each day that went by, people tried to fit the pieces together, but they couldn't. Some speculated that Rick was keeping quiet because he didn't want to damage his family's reputation. Others thought he might be keeping his son's best interests at heart, trying to protect him from the harsh realities of public judgment. But no matter what people thought, one thing was clear: the longer Rick stayed silent, the more curiosity grew. Fans, reporters, and even celebrities started to wonder if Rick would ever speak out about the situation. And so the story continued to unfold. The world waited for Rick Harrison to speak, but the silence persisted. People wondered, would he ever break his silence? Would he ever share his side of the story? And most importantly, what would he say when he did? The mystery of Rick's silence became just as much a part of the story as the crime itself, leaving everyone on edge, waiting for the moment when Rick would finally open up. For weeks the public waited in anticipation. Everyone was asking the same question: when would Rick Harrison finally break his silence? People were watching every move he made, every post he didn't make on social media, every interview that didn't happen. The silence surrounding him only added to the mystery. It was as if Rick had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a trail of questions that no one could answer. What was going on behind closed doors? Why wasn't he speaking? The curiosity surrounding his silence grew with each passing day, and the world became more and more desperate to know what Rick was really thinking. Rick Harrison, the tough businessman from Pawn Stars, was not someone people expected to keep quiet. He was known for his quick wit, his sharp business mind, and his ability to handle tough situations with ease. On TV he was always the one who had a clever comeback, the one who could negotiate a deal no one else could. But now, in the face of his son's life sentence, he was silent. It was hard for people to imagine this Rick Harrison, the man they had seen on their screens for so many years, just sitting quietly, holding everything inside. It wasn't just the fans who were curious. The media, the critics, and even his colleagues in the world of reality TV were all waiting for Rick to speak out. Everyone had their own theories about why he wasn't saying anything. Some thought he was too devastated to talk. Others believed that he was simply trying to protect his son from further humiliation. There were even some who thought Rick was angry, but didn't know how to express it. Whatever the reason, the silence became a story in itself. People started to wonder, was Rick ever going to speak? Would he ever give the world a glimpse into what was really going on in his life, or was he planning to stay quiet forever? Then one day, something happened. Rick Harrison finally spoke out. The news hit like a bombshell. After weeks of speculation, after days of wondering, Rick had finally decided it was time to say something. People couldn't believe it. The man who had been so quiet for so long was now ready to address the situation. What would he say? Would he open up about his feelings? Would he explain why he hadn't spoken before? The moment had finally come, and everyone was eager to hear what he had to say. Rick, says, first words were not what many people expected. He didn't start with an apology or a long explanation. Instead, he simply said he was in shock. He admitted that he was still processing everything that had happened. In his own way, Rick was telling the world that this wasn't just a headline. It wasn't just another story about a celebrity family falling apart. This was real. This was his life, and he was struggling to understand how it had all come to this point. He wasn't pretending to have all the answers. In fact, he didn't have any answers. What he had was confusion, pain, and a deep sense of loss. The honesty in Rick's words was unexpected. People had been waiting for him to speak, but no one knew what to expect when he finally did. And yet his openness in admitting that he didn't have it all figured out made his words even more powerful. Here was a man who had spent years in the public eye, managing a successful business and TV show, a man who had built a reputation as someone who always knew what to do. And now, in the face of his son's life sentence, he was admitting that he didn't know what to do. It was a raw human moment that made people see Rick in a new light. The tough businessman from Pawn Stars was suddenly vulnerable, unsure, and searching for answers just like anyone else. But even as Rick spoke, there were still questions. His words were honest, but they didn't provide all the answers. What had led to this moment? What had caused his son to end up in such a terrible situation? Was there something Rick could have done differently? Would things have turned out differently if he had seen the warning signs earlier? These were the questions that still lingered in the air after Rick spoke. His words were powerful, but they left the world wanting more. People were still looking for the missing pieces of the puzzle, trying to understand what had really happened behind the scenes. There was also the question of how Rick's family would move forward. His son was facing a lifetime in prison, and that was a reality that no amount of money or fame could change. Rick had always been the strong, steady figure in his family, but now, in the face of such an overwhelming tragedy, how would he cope? How would he support his son through this? Would he be able to maintain the same strong business-like persona that had made him famous, or would this event change him forever? The questions about Rick's future, and the future of his family, were just as pressing as the questions about what had happened in the past. The silence had been broken, but the answers people were searching for were still out there, waiting to be discovered. And yet, despite the fact that Rick had finally spoken, the curiosity didn't go away. People still wanted to know more. They still wanted to understand how this all came to be. They still wanted to know how Rick was really feeling, and what he planned to do next. His silence had created so many questions, and even now, after he had spoken, those questions remained unanswered. In many ways, Rick's decision to break his silence had only deepened the mystery. What would happen next? Would Rick continue to speak out? Would he open up more about his feelings? Or would he retreat back into silence once again? As the days went by, people continued to speculate about Rick's future. Some believed he would continue to share his thoughts, while others thought he would go back to his quiet, private life. Whatever happened, one thing was clear. Rick Harrison's life had changed in a way that no one could have predicted, and the world was watching, waiting, and wondering what he would do next. For a while after Rick Harrison finally spoke out about the situation with his son, the world was still left in suspense. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple family problem. This was something deeper, more complex, and far more tragic than anyone had imagined. The silence had been broken, but there were still so many questions. People didn't know what to make of Rick's words. His admission that he was in shock, still processing the situation, made him more relatable than ever. But it also left a lot of room for curiosity. What was going through Rick's mind? What was going to happen to his family next? Was there more to the story than he was willing to share? Rick's honesty in his statement caught many off guard. The man who had spent years in the public eye, managing a business that had made him a household name, had never shown such vulnerability. He had always been the confident one, the one who could handle any situation no matter how difficult. But now, here he was, admitting that he didn't know what to do. It was a side of Rick that viewers had never seen before. It made people wonder how he was really coping with this situation. Was he trying to protect his son? Was he feeling guilty for not seeing the warning signs? Or was he just overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened? People couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for Rick and his family. The shock of his son's life sentence wasn't something that could easily be forgotten. It was a burden that Rick would carry with him for the rest of his life. The world wanted to know how he would handle this new chapter in his life. Would he be able to continue with his business and the show that had made him famous, or would the weight of this tragedy change everything for him? The curiosity about his future was just as strong as the curiosity about what had happened in the past. There was also the question of how this event would affect Rick's relationship with his son. In public, Rick and his son had always seemed to have a good relationship. They worked together at the pawn shop, appeared on the show together, and seemed to share a bond that was built on mutual respect and love. But now everything had changed. Would Rick be able to continue supporting his son, even though he was facing such a difficult future? Would he be able to maintain that fatherly bond, or would the weight of the situation drive a wedge between them? People were anxious to see how Rick would navigate this new reality. Would he stand by his son, no matter what? Or would he distance himself, unable to cope with the consequences of his son's actions? As the weeks went by, it became clear that Rick was trying to keep his family life as private as possible. He wasn't speaking much to the press, and he didn't seem to want to share too many details with the public. His decision to keep things quiet only made people more curious. What was going on behind closed doors? What was Rick really feeling? Was he struggling with guilt? Was he angry with his son? Or was he simply heartbroken, unable to find the right words to express what he was going through? The public was left in the dark, and the silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. One thing that many people were still wondering about was how Rick's son had ended up in such a dire situation. How could a young man with a successful father who had everything going for him end up facing life in prison? It didn't make sense. Some people began to speculate about the reasons behind his actions. Was it a result of poor decisions? Was he influenced by the wrong people? Or was there something deeper, something Rick had never known about his son, that had led him down this dark path? The questions were endless, and without answers, the story continued to linger in the minds of everyone who had followed the situation. For some, the story wasn't just about Rick and his son. It was about the impact that fame and success had on their lives. Rick had built his empire on TV, and millions of people had watched him navigate the world of pawn shops and history. But fame comes with its own set of challenges, and many people began to wonder if that fame had contributed to the problems in Rick's family. Was the pressure of being in the public eye too much for his son to handle? Was Rick too focused on his career to notice what was happening in his family? These questions made people rethink what they had seen on TV. The Pawn Stars they had watched for years was only part of the story. The reality behind the cameras was far more complicated. As more time passed, Rick continued to stay quiet. The curiosity surrounding him didn't die down. In fact, it only seemed to grow. People were still waiting for him to say more, to explain more. They wanted to understand how he was handling the situation. They wanted to know if he was okay. They wanted to know if his family would ever be the same again. But even as the questions mounted, Rick remained silent, keeping his private life just that private. It wasn't just the fans who were curious. Fellow celebrities and people in the business world also took an interest in what Rick was going through. Some reached out to offer support, while others tried to offer advice. But in the end, it was clear that Rick was dealing with this situation on his own terms. He wasn't ready to share everything with the world, and that was his choice. But the silence was still palpable. Every time he stepped into the spotlight, people couldn't help but wonder, was this the same Rick Harrison they had known for years? Or had this tragedy changed him in ways that no one could understand? The longer the silence continued, the more the public tried to piece together the story. They looked for clues in every interview, every photo, and every tweet. They wanted to understand how Rick was coping. They wanted to know if he was still the man they had admired, or if this tragedy had completely changed him. The curiosity remained, and the mystery surrounding Rick's silence became a story in itself. It was a reminder that behind every celebrity, there was a real person dealing with real problems, just like anyone else. In the end, the silence was both frustrating and fascinating. It kept people coming back, waiting for more. And it made them wonder what would happen next. Would Rick ever fully open up about the situation, or would he continue to keep his feelings hidden, letting the world speculate about what was really going on? The questions remained unanswered, and the world continued to wait for the next chapter in the story of Rick Harrison and his family. As time passed, Rick Harrison's story remained a topic of deep curiosity and intense speculation. The public was still waiting for more answers, but Rick had chosen to keep much of his life private. This silence created even more intrigue. It was as if the world was watching a puzzle that wasn't ready to be solved. Every detail was examined closely, from his interactions with the media to his social media activity, and still, the mystery surrounding his feelings and thoughts on his son's life sentence grew deeper. People didn't just want to know what had happened, they wanted to know how Rick felt about it, how it had changed him, and what it would mean for his future. Rick had been the face of Pawn Stars for years, and his sharp, calculated persona was something that fans admired. He was known for being a man who could handle anything, whether it was a difficult negotiation or a tough decision in his pawn shop. But this situation with his son facing a life sentence was unlike anything Rick had ever faced. His usual confidence seemed to have slipped away, and the silence in the aftermath of the sentencing left everyone wondering what was going through his mind. There were still so many unanswered questions. Was Rick angry? Was he disappointed in his son? Or was he just heartbroken, trying to process a reality he never saw coming? The longer Rick stayed quiet, the more people speculated. His fans, the media, and even his colleagues all wanted to understand what was going on inside his head. Why wasn't he speaking more about what had happened? Was he trying to protect his son, or was he avoiding the harsh reality of the situation? This silence seemed to make Rick even more of a mystery. People weren't just curious about the crime itself, but also about how a man like Rick, who had seemed to have everything under the man who had built a successful career on television, whose business thrived and whose public persona was unshakable, was now struggling in ways that no one could have imagined. It was almost as if the world was waiting for him to crumble, but Rick remained composed, his emotions hidden beneath the surface. But as the silence stretched on, it was clear that the weight of the situation was taking its toll. Rick had always been a strong, steady presence on TV. He had built his empire with hard work, determination, and an understanding of the people around him. He was a man who could negotiate with anyone and come out on top. Yet now, in the face of his son's conviction, he was facing a challenge that no amount of business savvy could help him overcome. This was personal. It was about family, and in that moment, Rick's ability to handle the situation like a business deal didn't seem to matter anymore. The curiosity surrounding Rick's personal life only deepened as he continued to stay silent. Fans, reporters, and the public wanted to know what was going on behind closed doors. Was Rick still the same person they had seen on TV, or had this tragedy changed him in ways they couldn't understand? There was a growing sense that something had shifted inside him. Perhaps he was questioning his decisions, wondering what he could have done differently. Or maybe, as some people speculated, he was just struggling with the reality of a situation that he couldn't fix. It was hard to know what Rick was really going through, and that uncertainty kept people coming back, looking for answers. Some even began to wonder if Rick's life as he had known it would ever be the same. His son was facing a life sentence, and that reality could not be ignored. For years, Rick had lived in the public eye, managing a successful business and TV show, but now his personal life was thrust into the spotlight, and the world was watching. Would Rick be able to continue with his career? Would he be able to keep his business running smoothly? Or would the emotional toll of his son's actions lead him to step away from the limelight? These were questions that the public was eager to have answered, but as time went on, it became clear that Rick wasn't ready to share those answers just yet. The longer Rick remained silent, the more questions arose. Had he missed signs of his son's troubles earlier on? Could he have done something to prevent this tragedy? Was his relationship with his son as solid as it seemed, or was there something that Rick hadn't known about his son's life? People began to look back on past episodes of Pawn Stars, trying to find clues that might explain the situation. Was there any indication that things weren't as perfect as they appeared? Could fans have missed something too? These questions created an air of mystery around Rick, and the curiosity only grew stronger. Fans were desperate to understand what had gone wrong and how a family that seemed so tight-knit could end up facing such a devastating reality. But with Rick staying quiet, those questions remained unanswered. The silence only fueled the speculation, and people couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the Harrison family. As more time passed, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just about what had happened in the past, but about what was to come. Would Rick and his son ever be able to rebuild their relationship? Would Rick ever be able to forgive his son for the choices he had made? These were questions that no one could answer, not even Rick himself. The public once again was left waiting for a sign, something that would give them a glimpse into the mind of the man who had built his career on being transparent and in control. Rick's journey from a confident businessman to a father caught in the middle of a nightmare was something that many could relate to. It was a reminder that no one is immune to life's toughest challenges, no matter how successful they are. And as people continued to watch from the sidelines, they couldn't help but wonder, how would Rick's story end? Would he ever find peace with the situation, or would he continue to struggle with the aftermath of his son's actions, trying to make sense of a tragedy that had shaken him to his core? The mystery surrounding Rick Harrison was far from over. Every new piece of information only led to more questions, and the world continued to watch, waiting for him to speak out again. Would he ever share the full story? Would he find a way to move forward, or would he be forever marked by the events that had turned his world upside down? Only time would tell, and as the days went by, the curiosity surrounding Rick Harrison grew stronger than ever.